Thank you, Carl, and thank you to the Bookworm for letting us be here, if only virtually. First, I'm going to read just a short passage from the prelude, the introduction to my book. It features a guy named David Luth, who is a farmer in Southwest Iowa, lives in a floodplain, farms in a floodplain, and it takes place, the scene begins in 2011. Luth has a wide nose and bright eyes, quick to smile and quick to cry. He favors round glasses, bucket hats, sandals, and the occasional tie-dye. His shaggy hair has gone gray. Though Luth, a Christian and an avid bow hunter, is a registered Democrat, he shares a distrust of big government with his Republican neighbors. After the flood of 2011, he and his neighbors felt betrayed. The government had promised to protect them from the river, but it hadn't. Yet, by July of 2018, Luth had canceled his flood insurance. While the Missouri River had been high for several years in a row, he believed that the events of 2011 were an anomaly. Since then, the locals in the Corps had spent a lot of money and time repairing and strengthening the levees. "I'm going to be dead before it all happens again," said Luth, then 61 years old. 8 months later, it did happen again. Early one Friday morning in March of 2019, the Missouri breached a levee near Bartlett, Iowa, 10 miles north of Luth's house. The water was coming his way. The sheriff ordered everyone between the highway and the river to evacuate. Again, Luth disregarded the order. He had soybeans worth $10,000 stored in a bin beside his house. If the beans got wet, they would swell and rot. He had to move them to high ground. The flood's cause was obvious enough to Luth. It had been a cold winter, and 5 days earlier, a foot of snow lay on the ground. Then a bomb cyclone, a sudden drop in barometric pressure, moved over the Midwest and temperatures rose into the 50s. As all the snow melted, more than 2 inches of rain fell. The frozen ground could not absorb the water, which ran off into rivers and streams. The Little Sioux, a tributary of the Missouri, rose 14 feet in 24 hours. Luth scrambled to buy new flood insurance, but the policy had a 30-day waiting period. He was too late. After trucking his soybeans to a nearby grain elevator, Luth lingered in the house that he had already gutted once. He had recently brought his daughter into his farming business. Based in the house, he knew he had to leave. The sky was blue and snow geese flew overhead. It was a beautiful day, but Luth could barely keep from crying. The prospect of abandoning his home and farm made him physically sick. He had thrown up twice that morning. Sandbagging the levee by hand, as he and others had in 2011, groaning and sweating to add a few extra inches of protection, was pointless. The river was rising too fast. The levee, built in the 1940s and rebuilt after 2011, just wasn't high enough. There was nothing Luth could do. He left. The following Monday, another levee breached to the south. Parked on an overpass of the now flooded interstate, he could see his house. It stood in a patch of dry land, but the water was rising. It had inundated a swath 3 miles wide from river to bluff and at least 25 miles long. The town of Bartlett was inundated. Hamburg, McPaul, Glenwood, Pacific Junction, Percival, all swamped. Some locals were already saying the damage was too much, that they wouldn't rebuild. In darker moments, Luth too thought, "Screw it, I'm done." Over the weekend, his sadness had given way to anger. He was certain the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, the federal agency that manages the Missouri River, could have done more. The massive dams upstream were supposed to control flooding. Why were they dumping water on him? Were rich South Dakotans with their summer homes on the lakes being spared at his expense? Or was it the ice fishermen? He'd heard that the Corps had to release water from the nearest dam or risk bursting it. If the dam wasn't helping, Luth thought, let it collapse. It couldn't be any worse. Confused, unsure about tomorrow, he prayed and prayed. Cut off from his property, Luth helped his friends and neighbors. While moving farm equipment to higher ground, he saw hundreds of deer running across a flooded field, flushed from the woods by high water. Watching the terrified animals fleeing, as he and his friend also hustled to move, Luth felt even more depressed. It seemed obvious to him that the river had changed, while the levees and dams built to manage it had not.
Thank you, Tyler. That was a wonderful reading, and congratulations on a really impressive accomplishment. Holding Back the River is a really strong book. So I love that passage because it's like so many parts of the book. It is a great example of the magic trick that you accomplish, that you perform in this book, which is you deliver an enormous amount of technical information, scientific, engineering information, history, politics, and you do it in a highly readable way. And that's because you've given us these people, like Luth that we just met. In fiction, we'd call them characters, but we get these people with developed backgrounds. We see them. You put them in scenes. You've structured the book in a way that the pacing is great. You use all the tools of narrative craft. Um, so at this point, I have two questions, and I guess we have to do a full disclosure here. I've known you for a long time. Your mom, Marla Kinney, is one of my most longtime and dearest friends. So I know that when you left Minneapolis to go to college in New York, you were not planning to study journalism, and you didn't study journalism. So tell us what you did study and what fascinations and curiosities you found there that became the pathway to your becoming a writer and specifically to writing this book.
Well, thank you, Anna, for that great introduction and an excellent question. So let's start. All right, so I majored in literature and philosophy at Eugene Lang College at the New School in New York City. So at that point, I don't know, I don't think most 18-year-olds know much about what they want, maybe nor should they be expected to, but I just like to read books. So I basically majored in reading books, mostly fiction. And then I think it took many years after that for me to realize that my longstanding interest in sort of poking around places where maybe I wasn't supposed to go, or maybe where most people didn't go, just kind of exploring in cities and then later, along waterways and rivers. I love to go to these places, especially rivers. So I got really interested in taking these kind of boat camping trips where you would load all your stuff up into a little aluminum boat with a 9 horsepower engine and chug down these rivers. And I actually started doing that before I was a journalist and way before I ever thought of this book. But what I would do is, we'd go through these lock and dams. And so I realized as I was putting down this river, and this to me was just sort of a summer camping trip, that you'd go up to this big giant, brutalist government structure, and you'd pull this little tiny rope and the bell would ding. And this whole massive thing would operate just for my benefit, for free. I didn't have to pay anything. I was astonished that this would work for me. And then I saw this little castle logo, which is the US Army Corps of Engineers. And I realized that one governmental agency had proposed to not only build this giant lock and dam that operated for my benefit, but dozens and dozens more, managing this entire river. And on one of those trips, our outboard motor broke down on a tail end of the Ohio River at lock and dam number 53 on the Ohio. And the lock workers there, Randy Robertson and his guys, were kind enough to actually let us spend the night at the lock. And this was a really kind of old fashioned, steam powered cement, New Deal 1920s era facility. And I think that was when I really became thrilled and compelled by this whole world that was existing down there on the rivers. And at that point, I didn't even know how I could write about it, but I started sort of taking notes, talking to people, getting their names. And I think it took a while to figure out, okay, I'm interested in these places. I think I've seen something, I've met somebody maybe that other people haven't seen or other people haven't met that would be of interest to them, which is sort of how you start to market something as like a piece of journalism. And then the question is like, how do you find an angle that's current? And so when infrastructure was really buzzy term during the 2016 election, I thought, okay, I know this old piece of infrastructure, and everyone's saying infrastructure is aging, and everyone says this is a big deal. So maybe I can try to write about my lock and dam guys that I had met 2 years before, because their lock was really old. And it turns out their lock was actually also one of the most critical in terms of commerce. I think it was 80 million tons moved by there each year. And this thing was literally crumbling. And so I was able to do a story for the New York Times about that lock and dam 2 years after I just happened to get stranded there, basically. And the book really evolved from there, delving into this world on the waterways that I discovered. And I guess my career as a journalist just evolved from saying, the places I want to go anyways, the things I want to do anyways, the people I want to meet anyways. How can I turn this into something I might be able to get paid to do, instead of trying to sneak into some government facility and getting yelled at? How can I get invited in instead?
I love that. We have a couple students here, so I'm wondering if you'd talk a bit more about specifically your research and reporting skills, which phenomenal reporting in this book. So, and you say you wrote this in 2 years, which confounded me. That's a lot of work in 2 years. So can you talk a little bit about the process of the research and reporting you did?
Sure. Yeah. And anyone out there who wants to write a book, let me first say, this is probably not the most efficient way to write a book. So don't take my advice on this. But so, I think it was a year, maybe a year and a half of reporting, a year of writing, and then a year of kind of like post-production, fact checking, copy editing. But so initially, when I had the green light to do the project, I just started, and I got my advance, so I had some money. I just started buying plane tickets to every place where I thought something interesting was happening on the waterways right now. So I tried to find what's happening right now, go to different communities, different towns. What do they care about? What are they worried about? What problems are there? So I'd say, okay, there's a flood rising on the Mississippi in southern Illinois. I'm going to fly there right now to catch the flood. I'm going to go talk to a community who's living behind a levee, who's flood fighting on that levee, whose home is at risk. And then also I started going to these meetings, this entity called the Mississippi River Commission, which, if anyone's read John McPhee's fantastic story Atchafalaya, about the Atchafalaya River down in Louisiana, I learned about this commission from McPhee's story. And so the commission still exists. It's existed for 150 years. And I started going to their meetings, which are held twice annually. And so it's really a cool exercise in democracy, because all these big shot generals and stuff who really have a lot of power in terms of like river policy, generals of the Corps of Engineers, people who go to Washington and talk to Congress, will pull this deluxe boat up on the little wharf of a tiny town in southeast Missouri, population like 500. And anyone from that whole area who wants to drive up and park their car in that little town can go aboard this boat and testify, meaning like complain, speak, say whatever they want to all these generals. And I thought, first of all, it was so this is how I started to figure out, what do people care about down in these regions, right? In these towns, in these counties, in these states. I'd go to these meetings. So people would get up and they would just say, they'd just say, this is what I want you to do. This is what's problem in my town. This is what's problem with my boat ramp, my levee, my this. And those meetings were a fabulous way for me to meet people, because I heard someone say something interesting and I just try to grab them before they left the meeting. And then I also got to know the commissioners, because I would keep going on these meetings over and over again. So some terrific insight I got came from the Mississippi River commissioners themselves. And I also got plugged into sort of the hierarchy of the Army Corps of Engineers, met some of their top leaders and also some of their top scientists, which turned out to be like really fascinating people to speak with. They have, fabulous scientific facilities and are doing some really interesting research into the river. So that was a big part of the process too. But I bounced around all over the country, and a lot of the stuff I didn't make it in the book. And I should apologize to each of the people who gave me a lot of their time, and I didn't end up putting them in the book. But I think anyone who crafts a piece of writing knows, you can't really feel obligated to every source or every conversation that you ever had. But
it's kind of like sedimentation. The various conversations you have, the information you gather, it doesn't all come to the surface, but it's down there bolstering the project. Tell us about when you came out here. At what point was it? You did a lot of research on the Missouri and in our general area, Nebraska, Omaha, South Dakota.
Yeah, I think I made 2 trips to your general area. I'm trying to remember how it began. The main thing I think I was trying to do at first was look into the buildup of sediment behind Gavin's Point Dam, which is a big dam you all probably know, up on the Missouri near Yankton, South Dakota. And I think I had found out somehow reading something that the sediment, which of course, water moves, right? And we all know that, but it also carries material in it, clay, silt, right? So there's water moving and there's also stuff, dirt, whatever in the water. So when you build a giant dam and you don't put in anything to manage sediment, the sediment is stuck behind the dam and the water keeps going. I think, I tried to explain it simply in the book, but basically this reservoir, if you think of like a pool of water created by the dam, is filling with sediment rather rapidly because it's a very sediment heavy piece of river and the dam is fairly small, although you wouldn't think about that to look at it. So it's causing all these problems. And there's an organization, Missouri River Sediment Action Coalition, I believe that's the acronym, that is actively trying to do something about this. And I thought, okay, here's a problem and here's someone trying to solve it. So that's the great reason to fly to Omaha and drive up there and try to figure out what's going on. So Sandy Stockholm, who is she's sort of, in charge of that organization, was kind enough to take me around and introduce me to all kinds of people. And, again, there's so much going on there. There's all these negative consequences from letting that sediment build up behind the dam. So it's raising the water table around the town of Niobrara, the town of Springfield, the Santee Sioux Reservation, which is just downstream from Niobrara. So basically, because of a short-sighted bit of planning in the 1950s, the government is destroying all this land. And there have been various lawsuits over that land. There's going to be more lawsuits in the future. And so the cost to us, the taxpayer, for this, short-sighted decision not to put a sediment management function in the dam is costing hundreds of millions of dollars and is going to cost hundreds more. And so those kinds of moral, I don't really want to say anyone is like good or bad or right or wrong, but it's just I was really compelled all along the river by, you try to do something to control this powerful natural force and you create this real problem. And maybe there's a terrific benefit. In fact, I think a lot of those dams are built to protect Omaha from flooding. So if you all haven't really flooded in downtown or whatever since the 1940s, perhaps the dams are working, for something, for someone. But then there's also always a negative consequence. So who pays the cost and who benefits? And where are they? And what kinds of groups are they who are paying, and who are benefiting? I was just fascinated by that. And I found that all over the place.
Mm-hmm. Well, we did have flooding here in 2019. And I thought, as you were saying, the obvious thing to do is the obvious thing to do. But what I learned from your book is why it's so confoundingly complicated to not do the most obvious thing. I'm thinking of in 2019, the general from the Army Corps saying at a certain point, the solution is to move the levees back.
Mm-hmm.
So why not? So could you talk about the various complications that made it impossible to do the simple solution?
Yeah, and so, the book sort of ended around 2020. So I can't say for certain that none of that work has been done, but I think he was quite pessimistic about it at the time. And they tried to move the levees back after 2011 and they were unable to do it. And so, the way I think about it is there's sort of the science and engineering part, which is quite clear. Science is there's more rain. Engineering is if you want to handle more rain in your river, a higher river, more often you pull the levees back, you set them farther away from the river. That's pretty easy, pretty simple. The hard part is getting political will and, the buy-in of the public on these hard decisions. So I think when they tried to pull the levees back after the flood of 2011, and unfortunately the easiest time to reimagine a system like that is after it's just been destroyed, because a lot of it's wrecked and you're going to rebuild it anyways. So then you have an opportunity to rebuild it smarter, better, in a different place. I think the Army Corps people came down to Southwest Iowa and proposed this. But I think they already had a really sort of antagonistic maybe relationship with the locals. Probably no, I don't know whose fault that is, but so it was sort of they were sort of the bad guys coming into it, I think, and they were unable to sell it to the locals, and maybe they didn't put enough money behind it. Maybe they didn't do enough work kind of listening to people who live in that area about what they want and what they need. It felt like it was kind of a top-down approach, which I think doesn't work very well. So then you get into sort of sociological ways of like, how do you talk to people? How do you bring people in if you want to change something and make them feel like they're a partner in it? And I talk at the end of my book about how the Dutch have done that, I think, much more successfully than we have, by making people feel listened to, by taking people's suggestions seriously, but also by making people aware of the risk that everyone faces, and saying we need to do something to reduce this risk. So it's probably not a good answer because it's a hard question.
What I learned and saw so clearly is that one of the huge difficulties in there is that moving the levies back, you're taking farmland and the cost of that to the farmers. And then there's the environmental interest, and then it becomes political. So you do an excellent job of delineating all those varying stakeholders and the irreconcilability of the situation. However, there is that, so at the conclusion of your book, you say stasis is not an option. Change has to happen, but which change will it be? And then you give us a coda that is surprising. A good book always has a surprise ending, and this one really does. A completely unexpected aftermath to Hurricane Katrina. Would you talk about that?
Certainly. So I was really interested to learn when I started researching and talking to people in Holland that they consider Hurricane Katrina to be sort of the never again moment that really, well, they had a terrible flood, like a lot of places do, that changed their thinking about flood control. But then sort of the next thing that happened in the modern era was Hurricane Katrina, that made them rethink their whole approach to flood control, although not a drop of Katrina's rain, as I say, made it across the Atlantic Ocean. But what happened is they saw the Army Corps of Engineers and how unprepared they were in New Orleans for Katrina, because there was a system in place that got completely destroyed. And they said, okay, the weather's changing. We have to make sure that cannot happen to us. We got to look at everything we're doing and make sure that can't happen to us, because we can't afford that. A third of their country is below sea level. I think another third is vulnerable to flooding. So an equivalent to Katrina would have, could wipe out their whole country practically. So they looked at all of the sort of weather patterns going out, I think 200 years into the future, and they realized, no, they're not prepared with what they had. They have to build, their structures higher. But in addition to that, they have to actually take some structures down. They did a program called Room for the River. And so they actually, moved people's homes. They actually dug trenches to make more low land for the river to fill. Because again, you can protect yourself from a flood by building your walls higher, but you can also protect yourself by pulling the walls farther apart. And actually, sometimes you can gain a lot more protection by pulling them farther apart. And so, yeah, it's ironic, maybe is the word, but Hurricane Katrina inspired the Dutch to start taking their levees down, whereas it inspired us here in the United States to build, a big concrete wall around New Orleans. It's basically a walled city, if any of you have been down there. And most forecasts say it will be an island, in 50 years, because everything around it is sinking. And so I think it did not inspire much change of thought on our part in the United States, unfortunately, where it did inspire the Dutch.
I liked the you reported how whenever they went in to propose a change in a Dutch neighborhood or city or area, and they were areas that are marked by where the water goes, not by artificially drawn boundaries. I thought that was very interesting. But anyway, when they were proposing a change that might not be well accepted, they offered something that would be of benefit to the community, a park or a...
Right, and I think even more importantly, they created, I don't fully understand it, but it sounds to me like it was almost like a video game, like a software web thing that you could go on and you could test a flood mitigating scenario. Anyone could. So you could say, like, what would happen if we put a floating home here, and if this levied farmland became a park and the levee was set back there? So citizens actually could interact with this tool and see, okay, well, this wouldn't reduce risk very much, but then, oh, this would actually do a lot. So I think giving the people a sense of agency and like giving them a sense of like they're buying in, they're helping, and you're listening to what they say, but also giving them the tools to understand, like, okay, maybe this wouldn't work that well, and maybe this would be really beneficial, but you can find that out for yourself by playing this game scenario type thing. That to me, based on, I think it's Waterways, the Dutch equivalent to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, the way they explained it to me, this game thing, I mean, it seems like such a brilliant tool for, sort of communication and engagement over kind of difficult issues. And I think that's something there's no reason we couldn't replicate.
It's brilliant. The game, the electronic game aspect of it, because you automatically have several generations. You have the older generations that can't figure out how to do it, and the younger generation that they need to pull in to help them. So it's a kind of brilliant idea. Before we get to the questions, I do want to ask you one more writerly question. A
Please.
lot of feature stories these days are written in third person or in first person. Um, the new journalism technique of bringing the writer in, and you were on location in so many places, and you were clearly there because the level of detail is amazing. Why did you choose to write this in third person and keep yourself off the page?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. I think, I guess it's probably based because I'm a shy person. I don't think I'm that important or that interesting. But I also think I read so many feature stories and even books where I don't think the writer, the first person who's present in the story, really adds much to my understanding. And I don't think they're a particularly relevant character. And I don't really want to read a lot about their experiences and what they went through. So I was sort of, it was maybe more of a reaction, or maybe almost like a contrarian reaction to stuff that I read, where I wish sometimes that the writer would get out of the story, because that's not why I picked up the book most of the time. I picked it up to read about whatever this person learned and who they met and what they figured out. And I really like Tracy Kidder, and there's some people that do really cool novelistic third person stuff where they really embed themselves and they can write it. And I don't think I did this that well, but you can write it as if the person is a character in a novel, doing things, going places, having conversations. And you say, how did this person do that? And I think that's so cool. There's another really good book, Evicted, by Matthew, I think it's Desmond. He's a sociologist that I used to sort of as a model, not for like what the way I did the book, but just as a writer. I thought that was really cool how that was done. So yeah, I just don't think I'm, if I was writing about someone that I grew up with, I would have to put myself in. I think there's times when the writer has to put themselves in, but I think there's a lot of times when you don't. And I think a lot of people seem to approach magazine stories and books as if they always are in there and they always need to be in there. And I don't think that's true.
Mhm. You say you're shy, and a lot of writers are, in fact, introverted and shy. So, how did you get over that to go and approach these strangers, many, many, many strangers, um, to get the information you needed?
Yeah, maybe shy isn't the wrong word, but I don't like to talk about myself, which is actually a really good quality in a reporter, because a good reporter goes up to someone and gets that person to talk about themselves while not, having to go on and on about yourself. So I'm really interested in other people, and I love to talk to other people and learn about them, but I don't feel the need to interject any more of my own experience than is necessary. But um, I think, the simplest way to answer your question is just, I think I'm genuinely curious in what a lot of people are doing, and people respond well, I think, to like genuine curiosity. And also, I do a lot of research. So I teach journalism students, and I say, you want to go up to someone and ask a smart question that shows that you have studied their work, you're as familiar with it as you can be, but you also say, I'm a layperson. So, I speak to these scientists and I say, I read your whole article in the journal Nature, but, I don't really understand it because, it's not written for a layperson. Can you please explain it to me? and I think people respond really well to that. And they say, oh yeah, it was sort of this and sort of that. Um, I don't know, does that answer your question?
It does. It does. And I'm thinking curiosity is so important for you. And I remember you as a young kid, very, very curious and just this dynamic curiosity. Um, and I think that had something that was at work in the way you structured the book, because there would be so many moments when we'd be following, and I'm going to say a character, because they were like fictional characters that come to life on the page. And you bring them to a moment of crisis or a standoff moment. And then you wisely transition to something else. And I'm thinking, what's going to happen next? You've made me curious, and then you give me the background information I need, maybe for a page, and then we transition back to that um, person's story. So
Thank you.
yeah,
And I guess that's also, it, it's hard. You have to try hard not to be boring when you're writing about, sediment and geology and hydrology and infrastructure. And so, I tried to use, as you said, people's stories and their experiences to make this stuff as interesting as possible. And I think maybe if I left you on a cliffhanger, that was my chance to get some kind of less interesting material in there, and you would tolerate reading about it, because you knew it had to do with this person's life. And then I'd let you read, I'd have you learn that and hopefully not lose your interest by the time we got back to what we were talking about, the person's story. And I think character is fine because, in a way, the person that I portray isn't really who that person is, even if, everything I say about them is true. Like, I'm only using, a sort of thin reflection of that real person. So in a way, like, I think you do turn people into characters as a journalist, and you try to do it in the most respectful way possible. But I wouldn't say that David Luth, as I just read about him, that isn't really who he is, even though all those things I said are true. But I'm sure he's much more than that. So I think the word character is apt, even with nonfiction.
okay. Well, I see one question has already been posted. Carl, should we transition to the questions at this point?
Sure, yeah.
Okay.
Um, all right. So, uh, Tyler, Susan Knight says, rebuilding or moving back levees in Iowa, Nebraska. My understanding is that ownership of levees is a complicating factor. It brings counties, poorer communities, and more entities into question. Is this correct?
Yes, certainly it's complicated. Most levies are governed by a levy board, which is comprised of various, usually people who farm behind the levee and probably own a lot of land behind the levee. So the levy board is empowered to make decisions about what happens with the levee. So there is a pretty organized system of governance for a levy. And I'm not saying it's equitable necessarily in terms of like poor communities and the good questions you bring up. But there is, if you want to talk to someone and say, you're in charge of this levy, here's my proposal, you can find those people. And it's a relatively small group of people, and they are in charge of the levy. But I think the key is, what can you offer someone if you want to make a big change? And one thing I have thought a lot about is, levies are usually put up to secure farmland, and usually what's on the other side of a levee is farmland. I think there are ways that flooding and farming can coexist that really haven't been explored very much in the United States and have a lot of potential. And so if you say you're not going to give up your land, you're not going to lose your land, it'll lose some of its value, but you can still use it most of the year for mostly what you used it for. I think that's a much more compelling way to approach someone, because of course the status quo is probably more comfortable than at proposing a change. So I hope that answers your question.
Um, so Nick kind of has like a comment question. So growing up in southern Minnesota and working highway construction in rural Minnesota, he is keenly aware of the vast use of tile to quickly drain fields and dump the water into township ditches, which then flow into county ditches, which flow into the river, etc. So do you ever hear any discussion or suggestion to compensate farmers to remove these tile networks in order to hold back the river?
So first of all, I know exactly what Nick's talking about, and it's the efficiency with which farmers drain water off their fields, essentially water that they don't want. So farmers are brilliant, when it comes to making sure their crop is optimal. So they have these really efficient systems of ditches that drain water right into the river really rapidly. And it does make it so rain that falls across an area of land does get to the river faster. And so to Nick's point, I have not heard of any program really designed to hold water, to keep water on the land longer. And it's not a bad idea. I think the question is, what would that land become? Because farmers are really loath to take any acre out of production. I think you'd have to have a sort of a proposal to say, well, how would you hold water on this land? Of course, it's possible to hold water on land, and a lot of the farmland that is utilized today, especially in the Mississippi Valley, used to be swamp and used to hold a ton of water, and it doesn't anymore. So I'm probably not giving them a very satisfying answer. It's not a bad idea at all. The question is, how would you, propose such a thing?
Steve Carter asks, did your research take you to Standing Rock and the protests surrounding the pipeline in North Dakota?
The answer is no. I didn't get into that, mostly because it was a huge topic, especially when I started writing my book. So I figured a lot of other people were writing about that. So I just tried to write about things that, weren't so well known.
Right. Shelby would like to know what you guys are both reading right now.
That's a good question.
Go ahead,
Tyler. Let's see. I'm actually reading the Aeneid for my book club, which is designed to read books that you would not read by yourself, that are either too boring or too long or too old for you to want to read by yourself. So I don't know if I can wholeheartedly recommend the Aeneid, but I think I'm glad that I'm reading it.
That's funny. Mine is also a book club selection. We just finished the Ibis trilogy by Amitav Ghosh, and there are 3 novels. Oh gosh, they cover so much, but they are about the start of the Opium Wars in India and British colonization. And it's a lot of being on boats and waters. And so I've been on water a lot lately in my reading and have really enjoyed that. And a few months earlier, this group read Love in the Time of Cholera. So much of that came to mind as I was reading Tyler's book about the rivers. Yeah.
I like that concept for a book club, Tyler, because you're right. I think there's a lot of books that people say you should read, but I don't know if I would ever pick up
Yeah,
the Iliad if I didn't have to, or
exactly.
So, yeah.
Have you read Middlemarch in your group yet?
We did read Middlemarch.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Isn't it wonderful?
Yeah.
I am interested to know, you have done this documentary with your wife and you've now written this book. Are you working on anything right now, or just articles at the time, or do you have another book in the works, or what are you working on?
Yeah, I don't have anything concrete. I guess I just spent a lot of time thinking about the part of the country that essentially has too much water and is going to continue to have too much water. So I'm interested in the other part of the country, across the 100th meridian, the dry part of the country that doesn't have enough water, and I think will continue to not have enough. So I'm interested in going out farther west than I was before and seeing what's going on over there. But that's about all I've got so far. I've been stuck at home. I need to go on a trip and just go wander around and find some more stuff. As I told Anna, that's my favorite part of the process. So.
Mm-hmm. Tyler, I was curious, where were you with this project in March of 2020? How much of an impact did the pandemic have on this project?
Very little. I mean, I was lucky in many ways, in regards to the pandemic, but I was fact checking it, I think, at the end of fact checking it and copy editing it. So, other than the people from my publishing house being at home rather than the office, I don't think it impacted us at all.
So you had the contract, you'd sold it.
Oh yeah, it was. This is a movie term. It was like in post production. It was done. You know, we were just. The fact checking was mostly what I did through all last spring and last summer. So I was just calling or emailing every single person that I'd ever met and asking them if what they said, what I thought they said was really what they said, and et cetera. So that part wasn't that hard to do. You know, everyone was stuck at home. Probably actually it was easier because, you know, they didn't have much to do except for respond to my emails.
Right.
So no, yeah, I'm really lucky that I was in fact checking. I mean, that's exactly where you want to be, a homebound part of the process.
Right.
I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I saw that Rick unmuted yourself. Do you have a question, or was that unintentional?
No, I do have a question, and Tyler, it's good to see you. I think your book is most timely and probably one of the most important comments on infrastructure needs in this country. And given the political discussion about infrastructure, our waterways ought to be front and center. And I'd be curious your thoughts and maybe recommendations, I guess, particularly with respect to Lewis and Clark Reservoir. What do you recommend, or what are your thoughts about actually implementing a solution to the Lewis and Clark sediment issue? In any respect, political, engineering, hydrological, sedimentation, economic. How do you cut through all of those?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I want to thank Rick. He was one of the people that I said Sandy Stockholm introduced me to. Rick drove me around the village of Niobrara over July 4th weekend. I think it was almost 3 years ago now. So Rick is one of said characters. If he feels like being called that, we should ask him. But to answer your question, Rick, in terms of what's the best mechanism or technique to remove sediment from behind the dam, I would defer to the experts on that. But I think the thing that I thought was most illuminating is to talk about when the Army Corps or anyone in the government looks at a project, how do they assess the cost versus the benefit? And what do they think of as a benefit? So I think if there can be some kind of reform along this logic of costs and benefits, I think there are a lot of costs and benefits that aren't getting captured in the current model. And so I think people are talking about, how do we prepare for climate change, all these changes we know are going to come. And so I think if we look at older structures like the Gavin's Point Dam, which is from 1955, I think all of these things, if you're going to talk about spending billions of dollars, trillions of dollars in infrastructure, the first thing to do is look at it and say, okay, what purpose does this serve? Do we still value that purpose? Is the purpose still worth spending money on? If it does it reflect our values, that we currently have, and does it reflect the assumptions, the truths we now know about where the climate is going? And so I think if the government could approach pieces of infrastructure with that sort of fresh look, I think you'd find that a lot of things aren't serving the purpose they were designed to, or they never did, or that purpose is long gone, or that purpose, reflects a set of values we no longer hold. So I think it'd be really interesting to look at Gavin's Point Dam and say, who does it benefit? Who does it harm? A lot of the things that I looked at seem to say the only real reason for Gavin's Point Dam to even be there is to aid navigation downstream towards Kansas City and Omaha. And as far as I can tell, that industry is really tiny. And so I think if you were to be able to have a fresh look at it, the harm it does to the environment, the harm it's doing to the communities upstream from the dam versus the benefit of recreation to the region, which is substantial, near Yankton, and the benefit to navigation, which I think is debatable. I think someone just needs to have an honest conversation about those costs and those benefits. That would be what I would hope could happen.
Yeah, it's very difficult to get a federal congressional appropriation, which is what it would take one way or another to convince the government to act. If you give the Corps of if you give the Corps the money, they can fix that problem. It is just a matter of economics. They could have designed it that way to move the sediment around or under the dam. the science was there to do that at the time. But it's kind of like a foxhole. You'll fix a pothole. You'll fix a pothole because people drive over it all the time.
Mhm.
But eventually, you have to, reconstruct the interstate highway system. And short-term thinking seems to dominate. And I was just wondering the best way to activate the politicians to fund the solution to fix the waterway issues, not just Gavin's Point, but how do you get their attention to open up the resources of the United States for long-term solutions to inevitable problems? Is that just pure political communication?
No, you're right on. I don't have a good answer. I mean, I think the key is thinking. And if you read Biden's American Jobs Plan, there is quite a bit of fresh thinking in there. So I'm hopeful in that regard that it doesn't seem to be sort of a knee-jerk like reiteration or doubling down on the status quo. So the question is, when that gets into a real bill that can actually have an impact on the country, how much of that sort of reimagining is going to be there? And I don't know. You'd have to get with lobbyists and Congress people to solve that question. But Sandy Stockholm is making some much more intelligent comments than I did about the costs and benefits of Gavin's Point Dam. So I would defer to her when it comes to this.
Yep.
I can pull out this one. David Kelley's asking, do you know how or whether Biden's infrastructure bill addresses the needs of America's rivers? And I do know that the word waterways appears, I think, only twice in a fairly lengthy, fact sheet for that bill. And I think there's talk of $17 billion, but it's unclear how it would be distributed between, I think, ports, ferries, and waterways. So it doesn't look like very much. It doesn't look very ambitious when you talk about what's in that bill on the waterways. And also, I think a point that needs to get made that isn't made often enough is that American Jobs Plan is really mostly about jobs. So people have looked at it, and somewhere between 20 and 25% of the $2 or so trillion is actually for hard infrastructure that we think of as infrastructure, traditionally what we've thought of as infrastructure. So everything, or a lot of things in that bill, I think are good things that we need as a country, but from an infrastructure perspective, it's not that ambitious. So 25% of 2 trillion is 500 billion, and it's over 10 years. And so prior to Biden coming in, Hillary Clinton, when she campaigned in 2016, said she was going to spend 500 billion on infrastructure right away. And then Donald Trump said he was going to spend $1 trillion on infrastructure right away. Of course, none of that happened. But Trump, Pelosi, and Schumer in the spring of 2019 came out talking about $2 trillion on infrastructure. That didn't happen either. But people I don't think, understand that Biden's plan in terms of infrastructure is actually less ambitious than what Pelosi, Schumer, Trump, or Clinton proposed in terms of hard infrastructure, traditional infrastructure. And so I think that's something to think about when we go all over the news and talk about how revolutionary this plan is.
All right. Well, if anybody has any final questions, I'll give you a moment to get those typed out. But if not, I am just going to share the link to purchase the book here again in the chat. If you're interested in a copy, I know that Tyler would appreciate the support, and as an independent bookstore, we would certainly as well. Yep, just a couple more thanks in the chat, but I don't see any more questions. So
Well, I wanted, excuse me, Eric, just a second. Tyler, I'm seeing some comments here from Sandy Stockholm that you might want to address.
Well, probably better would be to have put Sandy on the microphone, because Sandy has much more to say about this, and she's just much more informed than I am. So maybe the best thing to do is, if Sandy, do you want to put a link to MSAC's website? If people have more questions about what's going on with Gavin's Point Dam and sediment, I would prefer you not to talk to me, but talk to Sandy Stockholm, who's here. So maybe it makes sense for Sandy to put a link to her website or something on the chat. There you go. So don't take my word for any of this stuff. As a journalist, I would always tell you to go to the primary source. And that in this case is Sandy Stockholm when it comes to sediment on Gavin's Point Dam.
I appreciate that, Tyler. Can you hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
But no, I think it's just really great that Tyler's written about this topic because it's especially sedimentation. I think like he's mentioned, it's not a real exciting topic, and to keep it interesting and get people's attention, it's not easy. But we do want to answer some of those questions, and it is a very important resource to the people in this region and people downstream. And we are engaged in a study project with the Corps of Engineers to answer some of those questions about cost-benefit ratios, and really taking a holistic approach to sediment management, and realizing that the river, the reservoirs, it's a river system. So we really want everyone to be involved in this process. And it's really something that's important for future generations, not just our own generation.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sandy, for being here. You too, Rick. It really is great to have some of the people mentioned in the book live in the room. I would have had you guys do the whole conversation if I'd realized you were here.
Well, thank you, Tyler, for inviting me to talk with you. It's been wonderful. And thank you, Carl.
Thank you, Anna, for your preparedness and great questions. I always love when we have great conversation like this at these events. And Tyler, thank you for thinking of our store and bringing your book and your research full circle back to Nebraska. We were very happy to work with you.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Together, so.
The only way it could have been better if we were all here in person. So maybe next year.
Sometime soon. I hope that's the
case.
And
thank you everybody for coming. I really appreciate it.
Good. All right. Well, thank you again to everybody for being here. Like I said in the beginning, that these events can't happen without your participation. So thank you for being here, and everybody enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.